Before today's story begins, welcome to the channel. If you enjoy emotional stories about love, family, second chances, and the unexpected people who change our lives, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Every new story is inspired by real emotions and reminds us that sometimes the smallest moments leave the deepest marks. Now let's begin. My name is Claire Anderson. And until 2 years ago, I believed that a successful marriage looked exactly the way mine did. My husband, Ryan, and I owned a beautiful home in a peaceful neighborhood outside Portland. We had stable careers, healthy finances, and a calendar filled with dinner parties, vacations, and family gatherings. To everyone around us, we looked like the perfect couple. The only problem was, we hadn't truly talked in years. Not the kind of conversation where two people reveal what's hidden inside their hearts. Instead, our days had become routines. Good morning. Did you pay the electricity bill? I'm working late. Good night. Our marriage wasn't filled with arguments. It was filled with silence. Some people think silence means peace. They're wrong. Sometimes silence is simply loneliness wearing comfortable clothes. Every evening Ryan disappeared into his home office. I stayed downstairs pretending to enjoy television shows I wasn't really watching. The distance between us wasn't measured in rooms. It was measured in everything we no longer shared. I kept convincing myself that every marriage goes through difficult seasons, that things would eventually improve, that tomorrow would somehow feel different. Tomorrow never came. Then one rainy Saturday morning, I met the woman who changed my life. Her name was Eleanor Brooks. She had recently moved into the small blue house next door after losing her husband of 43 years. She looked fragile, tiny, soft-spoken. But behind those gentle eyes was a strength I couldn't explain. The first time we spoke, she caught me standing outside collecting the mail in the rain. "You don't have to pretend you're okay," she said with a warm smile. Those words caught me completely off guard. I laughed awkwardly. "I'm sorry." She simply nodded. "I've been married before," she replied gently. "I recognize lonely people. For reasons I still don't understand." I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and I became friends. Every afternoon we shared tea on her porch. She never judged. She never interrupted. She simply listened. And somehow, being listened to felt like something I had forgotten existed. One afternoon she handed me an old photograph. It showed her and her late husband dancing barefoot in their backyard. "We weren't wealthy," she smiled. "But we never stopped choosing each other." Those words stayed with me long after I returned home. That evening Ryan walked through the front door nearly 2 hours later than usual. Without looking up from his phone he muttered, "Anything for dinner?" "Not." "How was your day?" "Not." "I missed you." "Just dinner." For the first time in years, I noticed the difference instead of excusing it. Eleanor wasn't teaching me to leave my marriage. She was teaching me to see it honestly. And sometimes, seeing the truth is the hardest part of all. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was completely silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain tapping against the kitchen window. Ryan was still asleep upstairs. For a moment, I watched the first rays of light stretch across the hardwood floor and wondered when our home had started feeling more like a hotel than a place where two people built a life together. I made coffee out of habit, poured 2 cups out of instinct, and smiled sadly when I realized only one would be touched. Ryan had been leaving before I even finished breakfast for months. As I carried my mug to the back patio, I noticed Eleanor already tending to the flowers in her garden. She wore an old straw hat and gardening gloves that looked almost as old as she was. When she saw me she smiled. "Couldn't sleep?" she called gently. I laughed. "Is it that obvious?" She nodded. The people carrying the heaviest hearts are usually awake before everyone else. Those words settled deep inside me. I walked over and joined her by the white roses lining her fence. "They're beautiful," I said. "They survived a harsh winter." Eleanor replied while trimming a branch. "Sometimes the strongest blooms come after the coldest seasons." She always seemed to speak in lessons instead of ordinary conversations. I admired that about her. Over the next hour, we talked about everything and nothing. Childhood memories, favorite books, the places we dreamed of visiting but never had. Then, almost without thinking, I admitted something I hadn't even confessed to myself. I don't think Ryan sees me anymore. Eleanor stopped working. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited. I don't mean physically, I continued. He knows I'm there. He just doesn't notice who I've become. She placed the pruning shears on the table beside us. There's a difference between living beside someone and sharing a life with them. The sentence echoed in my mind long after I returned home. That evening I decided to do something different. Instead of waiting for Ryan to ask about my day, I asked about his. He looked surprised. Tiring, he answered while loosening his tie. What made it tiring? For the first time in months, he paused before answering. He spoke about deadlines, difficult clients, and the pressure he felt to keep everyone happy at work. As he talked, I realized something I hadn't expected. He looked exhausted. Not just physically, emotionally. Maybe loneliness had been living on both sides of our marriage. Still, understanding someone's struggles didn't erase my own. Days passed. Then weeks. Ryan made small efforts. He arrived home earlier twice that week. He even suggested we eat dinner together without our phones. It felt unfamiliar. Awkward. Almost like two strangers learning how to become friends. Meanwhile, my friendship with Eleanor continued to grow. One afternoon she invited me into her home for tea. The walls were covered with photographs. Some were faded. Some were cracked. Each one captured a different chapter of a long life filled with joy and heartbreak. She picked up a picture of herself dancing with her late husband beneath strings of lights. We argued, she admitted with a smile. Oh, we argued plenty. I laughed. You did. Of course. She looked at the photograph lovingly. The difference is that we always remembered we were on the same team. Her words lingered with me. That evening, I stood outside our front door longer than usual before going inside. Instead of replaying old disappointments, I asked myself a different question. When was the last time Ryan and I had acted like teammates? I couldn't remember. The realization hurt. But sometimes healing begins with honesty. A few days later, something unexpected happened. There was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Ryan stood there holding a small paper bag. I left work early, he said awkwardly. I remembered your favorite bakery was on the way home. Inside the bag were 2 warm cinnamon rolls. My eyes widened. He hadn't bought my favorite pastry in nearly 6 years. I wasn't sure if you'd still like them, he admitted. I smiled softly. I never stopped. We sat on the porch together as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Neither of us spoke much. For once, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. Across the street, Eleanor glanced toward us from her garden. She smiled quietly before returning to her flowers. She never tried to fix my marriage. She simply reminded me that love requires attention, patience, and courage. Sometimes all a person needs is someone who believes they're worth fighting for before they can believe it themselves. And although neither Ryan nor I knew exactly where our future would lead, for the first time in years, we were finally walking toward it together. The following weekend arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze that drifted through the neighborhood. It was the kind of Saturday that used to make me excited. Years ago, Ryan and I would have planned a road trip, visited a farmer's market, or spent the afternoon hiking. Somewhere along the way, those simple traditions had quietly disappeared. To my surprise, Ryan walked into the kitchen before 8 o'clock that morning, dressed casually instead of wearing his usual work clothes. I don't have to go into the office today, he said. I looked up from my coffee. You don't? He shook his head. No. And I was wondering if you'd like to spend the day together. For a second, I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly. It had been so long since he'd asked me to do something simply, because he wanted to be with me. A cautious smile crossed my face. I'd like that. An hour later, we found ourselves walking through the local farmer's market. The smell of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and blooming flowers filled the air. Children laughed as they chased each other between the stalls, while musicians played soft acoustic songs nearby. Everything felt strangely familiar, like revisiting a place I had once called home. Ryan noticed a small booth selling handmade candles. You used to love these, he said. I still do. Without another word, he bought one in my favorite lavender scent. It wasn't the candle that touched me. It was the fact that he remembered. As we continued walking, our conversation slowly became easier. We talked about our first apartment, our honeymoon, the ridiculous old car that broke down twice on our way to the beach. For the first time in years, we laughed together instead of simply existing beside one another. Later that afternoon, we stopped at a quiet park overlooking a small lake. Ryan sat on a wooden bench, unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. I owe you an apology. I turned toward him. I convinced myself that working harder was how I showed my love, he admitted. I thought if I provided everything we needed financially, everything else would somehow take care of itself. His voice trembled slightly, but somewhere along the way, I stopped being your husband. Tears gathered in my eyes. I didn't need a perfect life, I whispered. I just needed you. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence can hurt. Other times, it allows truth to settle. When we returned home that evening, I noticed Eleanor sitting on her porch reading a novel. She looked up and smiled warmly. You two look lighter today. Ryan smiled politely. I think we're trying to remember how to be friends again. Eleanor closed her book. That's where the strongest marriages begin. Over the next several weeks, small changes became steady habits. Friday dinners became non-negotiable. Phones stayed off during meals. Sunday mornings were reserved for long walks through the neighborhood. We even started writing little notes to each other, leaving them beside the coffee maker before work. None of these things were dramatic, but together, they slowly rebuilt what years of neglect had nearly erased. Then one evening, everything changed again. I noticed an ambulance parked outside Eleanor's house. My heart immediately sank. Ryan and I hurried across the street. Emily, Eleanor's niece, stood outside with tears streaming down her face. She collapsed while watering the garden, she whispered. The paramedics worked quickly before taking Eleanor to the hospital. Hours later, Ryan drove me there. When I entered her room, she looked tired but peaceful. She smiled the moment she saw us. I was beginning to think flowers would outlive me, she joked softly. Even lying in a hospital bed, she managed to make everyone around her smile. She reached for my hand. I've watched you change, she whispered.